As a starting point, it is very important to mention who was Virginia Woolf. Born into an English household in 1882, she was raised by free-thinking parents, and she began writing as a young girl and published her first novel called The Voyage Out. Now, she wrote also some modernist classics books called, for example, To the Lighthouse, Orlando, and Mrs. Dalloway. And about her personal life, she was under pressure. She suffered a lot of depression. For that reason, she committed suicide to 1941 at the age of 59. Now, we are going to see a timeline with these key events in a very specific way with additional information.
1882. Birth of Virginia Woolf. Adeline Virginia Stephen is born. She is the third of 4 children born to Julia Princess Stephen and her husband Leslie. Virginia's parents are fixtures on the London literary and intellectual scene, and she grows up in a home full of books. 1895. Death of Virginia Woolf's mother. Virginia Woolf's mother, Julia Princess Stephen, dies. The family is plunged into mourning, and Virginia has her first major depressive episode. 1904. Death of Virginia Woolf's father. Leslie Stephen dies of stomach cancer. The loss of her father prompts a major mental breakdown, during which Virginia tries to commit suicide by jumping out of a window. The Stephen children sell their childhood home and buy a house together in the hip of Bloomsbury neighborhood of London. 1905. Contributor to Times Literary Supplement. At the age of 23, Virginia begins her professional writing career as a contributor to the Times Literary Supplement. She also takes on several jobs of the sort available to women at the time, such as teaching and reading to elderly ladies. 1910. Bloomsbury Group. The Bloomsbury Group was a circle of writers, artists, and intellectuals that eventually includes Virginia Woolf. 1912. Marriage to Leonard Woolf. Virginia Stephen marries Leonard Woolf, a Jewish intellectual who had served in the Foreign Service. The couple enjoy a happy, if unconventional, marriage that lasts until Virginia's death. 1914. World War I. Great Britain entered World War I. Most members of the Bloomsbury Group are pacifists and none of the men enlist. 1939. World War II. Great Britain declares war on Germany, marking England's entry into World War II. Fearing Nazi persecution due to Leonard's Jewish ethnicity, the Wolves make plans to commit suicide if England is invaded. They leave their home in London and move out to Monk's house at Rodmill, where they hope they will be safer. 1941. Virginia Woolf commits suicide. Convinced she will not recover from her current battle with mental illness, Virginia Woolf fills the pocket of her coat, stones, and drowns herself in the Ouse River near Monk's house. Her body is discovered 3 weeks later. Leonard Woolf chooses to have the body cremated, and the ashes are scattered at Monk's house.
Now, the Bloomsbury Group. It was a small group or informal association of artists and intellectuals who lived and worked in the Bloomsbury area in central London. Now, maybe this group was formed by novelists, journalists, painters, philosophers, and critics.
They had not a mission. They were not political in the ordinary sense of the word. Most importantly, there was no application or initiation required to become a member in this group. The most prominent of these subjects was novelist and essayist Virginia Woolf. Bloomsbury was an informal hodgepodge of intellectual friends, where the intellectual exchange served as the main influence in their works. It doesn't mean that they agree in all subjects. Now, if there is a founding document for the Bloomsbury Group, it is the Principia of Ethica, where George Edward Moore, the most influential English philosophers of the early 20th century, he railed against any school of thought which couldn't produce practical advance for human society. Of all of his contributions, his ethical formulations were possibly the most resonant then. Moore explains that good is not a thing that can be described or defined with other words, so it is simply known for what it is by all rational beings. Many of the Bloomsburys held particular ideas on human society. Between them, we have the sexual liberation or the polyamory, that it means a consensual romantic partners. One way of thinking about the Bloomsbury group is that they formed a bridge between the Victorians and the moderns.
The days of the modernist movement itself is a problematic term, as there was not a singular or consolidated movement. It is sometimes difficult to determine. The beginning of the 20th century is extremely convenient starting point.
The early 20th century was a massive explosion in scientific innovation. This era of modernist writers saw tremendous leaps in physics that shocked the world. For example, the theory of relativity, discoveries about ancient civilizations between others. Religious belief started to give way to science as the predominant way of understanding the universe. So I'm going to explain some of these key events. Artistic experimentation was with modernist writers, so artistic movements like Cubism and Surrealism definitely influenced writers. The unconscious appears Sigmund Freud. He founded psychoanalysis. So the ego, superego, etc. Freud thought that human beings had become civilized by repressing primitive drives. The imagism and vorticism. Pound invented imagicism, where it was direct, economical in its language, and composed in free verses. Then appeared the vorticism, which it refers to all the arts and not just poetry, which ideas are constantly rushing. Revolution, just to mention, we have the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and women's suffrage movement.
As all the important writers in their time, it's necessary to mention in a briefly way their works, and Virginia Woolf is not an exception. Even it's pertinent to know why she wrote those books.
1915, The Voyage Out. Woolf's first novel, The Voyage Out, is published. She had completed a year earlier, but publication was delayed by the war and Woolf's lingering depression. 1922, Virginia Woolf publishes Jacob's Room, a novel based on her brother's Toby's death. 1925, Virginia Woolf publishes Mrs. Dalloway, a modernist novel that follows protagonist Clarissa Dalloway through a single day of her life. 1927, Virginia Woolf publishes To the Lighthouse, a portrayal of the fictional Ramsay family as they vacation in Scotland. Both Virginia and Leonard Woolf believe it to be the best of her novels so far. It is definitely the best-selling, surpassing sales of all her other books. 1928. Woolf publishes the novel Orlando, a book inspired by Vida Sackville-West. The novel follows the gender-switching title character as he or she moves through several centuries of history. 1929. After giving a lecture series on women's literary abilities and obstacles, Virginia Woolf publishes the book A Room of One's Own. In it, she argues that in order to write, a woman must have independence, manifested in a material form as an income of certain amount of money per year, and a private room where she can write. 1931. Woolf publishes her most conceptually challenging novel, The Waves. The book is written in the voices of 6 different characters, and experiments with traditional notions of character, setting, genre, and plot. Woolf describes the book as a play poem rather than a novel. 1937. Woolf publishes the novel The Years, a bestseller popular with critics and readers. This novel traces the life of a Victorian family. 1938. Woolf publishes Three Guineas, a long essay arguing that if more women occupied positions of power, there would be less war. The book's tone is harsher than her previous feminist tract of A Room of One's Own and proves controversial upon publication. 1941. Between the Acts is her last novel, in which she returns to a less demanding literary style, despite being writing immediately before her suicide. She combines a playful wittiness with her satirical critique of English upper-middle-class life. 1953. Leonard Woolf published a writer's diary, which consisted in a collection of Virginia Woolf's personal journals.
Before giving the definition of who the suffragists were, it is important to notice why they appeared in England's history. At the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th, man was the leader of the first group that composed society, the family. Women were set aside, assigned to accomplished matters like taking care of children or cleaning the house. Besides, they had neither a profession nor any kind of legal right. On the one side, it was by 1793 when Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the first suffragists, asserted that women were not inferior regarding men. Also, she argued that the problem of the conception of inferior came from the fact that men built the hierarchy of society. So women were not able to express themselves and their abilities. On the other side, by the age of 1914, the government decided to accept the suffragist delegation, promoted by Sylvia Pankhurst, main representative of the movement during that period. As you can notice, there is a huge period from the first intervention for the vindication of women's rights and their acceptance in crucial political matters. That is what we are reviewing during this section. The most important women that represented this movement called the suffragists. First of all, Mary Wollstonecraft. 1759 until 1797. She was a writer and a feminist woman. Her most important novel, The Wrongs of Woman, had a great reception when it allowed her to afford a brand new house in London.
She worked there as a professor and translator. Besides, she was a member of a group of English poets, artists, philosophers, and painters, as Blake and Thomas Paine. On her most famous work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, it stated that the archetype of marriage lies on the intellectual affinity. She interceded for equal education and opportunities for both genders. This work is a combination, a guide of behavior and an educational treaty. It was written with the purpose of discussing the stand of women within society and her connections among right, reason. There is a clear quotation from her work that supports the conduct and manner, in fact, evidently prove that their minds are not in healthy state. For, like the flowers, which are planted in too rich a soil, strength and usefulness are sacrificed to beauty, and the flaunting leaves, after having pleased a fastidious eye, fade, disregarded and the stalk, long before the season when they ought to have arrived at maturity. Having the quote in mind, it seems that Wollstonecraft had a sharp perception of what women were, simple objects that needed to be observed by men. They had no chance to show their stock, intelligence, feelings, and so on.
Second, Lydia Baker, 1827 until 1890. She was an activist born in Manchester in 1827. One of her most important contributions was the foundation of the Manchester Feminine Suffrage Committee.
Years later, in 1870, she also promoted a newspaper called Suffrage for Women that posted news about events that affected any aspect of women's life. It was particularly focused on demonstrate the great support coming from the population on the United Kingdom's suffrage. She also was elected for the Education Committee in Manchester, aiming at approving the fact that boys could also sew, cook their own food, and carry out any task at home. Another important aspect of her life is that she was not kindly received by other suffragists that were married as Emmeline Pankhurst when she proposed the right to vote for single women only.
Third, Emily Davis, 1830 until 1921. She was an English feminist born in Southampton in 1830. Since childhood, she was conscious of the difference between men and women.
While her brothers were sent to study abroad, she was forced to stay at home. She devoted her life to make higher education possible for women and the practice of a profession only for men until then. She began persuading the admission of women in London University, Oxford, and Cambridge. In 1865, she establishes the Kensington Society, which some years later promoted a petition with 1,500 signings asking for the feminine right to vote. In 1875, she opens the first faculty of women, the Jordan College. This faculty was recognized as a Cambridge institution not until 1948.
4. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, 1836 until 1917. She was a British doctor born in Aldeburgh in 1836. From a rich family, she was supposed to stay at home until she found a man to marry.
Elizabeth was keener on getting a job. During her visit in London in 1854, she met Emily Davis, the woman that we already mentioned, and later the woman who would inspire her to become the first woman to be recognized for the status of doctor in England. She is Elizabeth Blackwell. She attempted to study in several medicine institutes, but each one of them rejected her. In this way, she was forced to become a nurse and attend conferences. After the complaints of a considerable number of male students from these institutes, she was banned to enter to any kind of conference. She discovered that the Pharmacist Society did not forbid the access of women, and in 1865 she passed the exams. However, as soon as the institution noticed this gap in the regulations, they changed the rules, not leaving any possibility for women to access to higher education. Despite of the obstacles, she was determined to obtain her title in medicine, so she went to Paris, but when she came back, the title was useless. In 1872, she opened a new hospital for women in London, an institution that was mainly managed by women.
Fifth, Emmeline Golding Pankhurst. She was a suffragist born in Manchester in 1858. As a leader, she managed the group of the suffragists defending the women's right to vote.
As an academic, she studied in the École Normale of Paris between 1873 and 1877. Her studies were on humanities. Some years later, she got married with Richard Marsden Pankhurst, an important attorney that supported equal rights for women in 1879. She also was one of the founders of the Women's Franchise League, created in 1889. This league was the key to achieve the endorsement of a law that permitted women to vote during the local elections in Manchester. In 1903, she settled her dispute with men, creating the Women's Social and Political Union in Manchester, a group that became famous when she moved to London and started to arrange public meetings and protests in front of the House of Commons of the United Kingdom. Her activity was more aggressive as time passed by. This is why she was put in jail several times since 1908 to 1913. One of the activities she is remembered for refers to her constant hunger strikes while facing the sentence in jail. Before that, she persuaded women to quit being suffragists and to devote themselves to the tasks of the First World War.
Sixth, Emily Woodling Denison, 1872 until 1913. She was a British activist born in London in 1872. The suffragist woman adhered herself to the Women's Political and Social Union in 1906.
Her first years of life were dedicated to education, but she finally decided to quit teaching and began a path to become a great suffragist. She was considered a rebel because of constant behaviors from shouting at politicians to throwing rocks to their cars, claiming that rebellion against tyrants was a God's wish. These kinds of events turned out into jail sentences. To the WSPU, she contributed with articles and reviews about the situation of women. Years after protests and several sentences in jail, she reached the conclusion that women were not going to be recognized as equal human beings. So she carried out 2 suicide attempts. One was in 1912, when she jumped from iron stairs and did not die, but suffered several injuries. It was not until 1913 that she totally recovered her health. However, the second suicide attempt happened. In June of 1913, she attended to one of the most important horse races in the city. Once the race started, she managed to go down into the track and tried to take control of King George V's horse, but instead got hurt in the cranium. She died without coming back to her senses. Although some suffragists put their lives in risk, she was the only one determined to commit suicide. After this event, the reactions were not in her favor. On the contrary, most people were worried about the horse's health and stigmatized Miss Wilding as a fanatic and mentally ill person.
Now let's talk about other cultural and artistic movements in 20th century. The first one was Dadaism. The Dadaism was a multidisciplinary art and cultural movement that appears during the World War I. The Dadaism was an intensely anti-war movement, anti-bourgeois movement, and held strong political affinities with the radical left.
For many participants, the movement was a protest against the colonialists' interests, which many Dadaists believe were the root cause of the war, and against the cultural and intellectual conformity in art and more broadly in society that corresponded to the war.
Dadaism began in Zurich in 1916. Dadaists worked in college in creating composition by pasting together, for example, some tickets or different artifacts or daily life.
Dada artists also worked in photomontage, a variation on collage that utilized actual reproduction of photographs printed in the press.
Realism was a movement that went on mostly in 19th century. And this movement talked about life, but in all its tiny details. In contrast to the Romanticism movement, these guys just told it like it was. In 20th century, realism saw an upsurge in the 1920s when the shock of the First World War. This war brought a kind of reaction known as the return to order, to the avant-garde experimentation of the pre-war period.
In Britain, there was the Euston Road School and the painter Meredith Frampton. Also, the British kitchen sink artists could be included, but they used essentially modern styles to paint realist subjects.
Surrealism was a cultural movement beginning in 1920s that sprang directly out of Dadaism and overlapped in many senses. Surrealist works drew inspiration from intuition and the power of the unconscious mind, and various psychological schools of thought. The work often features unexpected juxtapositions and non sequiturs and elements of surprise.
Surrealism developed out of the Dada activities during the World War I, and the most important center of the movement was Paris. From 1920, the movement spread around the globe and eventually affecting the visual arts, literature, film, and music of many countries and languages, as well as political thought and practice, philosophy, and also the social theory, because they believe that surrealism would advocate the idea that ordinary and representative expression was vital and important, but that expression must be fully open to the imagination. Freud's works with free association, dream analysis, and the unconscious was of a great importance to the surrealists as they developed methods to liberate their imaginations.
Like Dadaism, Surrealism aimed at revolutionizing human experience in terms of the personal, cultural, social, and political aspects. Also, Surrealists wanted to free people from false rationality and from restrictive customs and structures.
The first wave of feminism was placed in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. Urban industrialism, liberal and socialist politics created an environment that gave the background to this first wave. And this wave was focused on giving opportunities for women, and especially the right to vote, which is called also the suffrage.
The first appearance of the suffragist group was in the Seneca Falls Convention in United States in 1948, in which they began a rally for the cause of equality of women. In England, the movement of the suffragists had the name of Women's Social and Political Union. This movement was led by Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, who incited liberty of women through marches and claims in front of Downing Street, the place where the buildings of the Prime Minister's residence was but died age.
Now we have the second concept to define, which is called androgyny. Androgyny is the combination of masculine characteristics and feminine characteristics. However, there are some divisions in these two genders. Men have more opportunities to self-realization, and women feed more in something called selflessness, which is the care about the others. Listo.
Woman was urged to choose between these two types of personality, bearing in mind to renounce womanhood. What Woolf argues during the novel is the balance of the two personalities, without succumbing to either.
There is a third concept which is called gynocriticism, which is also called gynocritics. This term was used by Elaine Showalter to refer to a literary project that intended to create a female framework for the analysis of women's literature. And this is the reading of history, politics, and social studies, written precisely by women. There is one last concept that we would like to define, and this is called misogyny. Misogyny is the men's aversion for women's questioning and criticism of men's authority. And this could be seen as an answer in violent actions and mistreatment towards women.
To begin with this review of the novel itself, it is important to make clear that it is divided into three main sections: the window, time passes, and the lighthouse. Also, each section is fragmented by the different contributions of the characters with the technique called a stream of consciousness. This is a narrative mode. This narrative aims at sharing different points of view of the same event through the thoughts of the characters.
First, in the window, it reveals the context before the start of World War I. Mr. Ramsay and Mrs. Ramsay bring all their children to their summer home in a group of islands in Scotland called Hebrides. It turns out that in front of their house there is a gigantic lighthouse. During his first part of the novel, one of their sons, James Ramsay, actually desired to go to the lighthouse, and Mrs. Ramsay asserts that they will go once the weather permits. James is always expecting to go to the lighthouse, but Mr. Ramsay tells him that the weather will not ever allow them to go. With this behavior of Mr. Ramsay, James began to think that his father enjoys the fact of being cruel with the family. The Ramsays host several guests in their provisional house. Charles Stanley, for example, who admires the work on philosophy written by Mr. Ramsay. At the house is also Lily Briscoe, a young painter who begins a portrait of Mrs. Ramsay. One important fact is that Mrs. Ramsay is constantly pushing Briscoe to marry William Banks, an old friend of the family. However, Briscoe decides to remain single. That same evening, the Ramsays give a dinner party. Lily Briscoe reacts with annoyance when Charles Stanley began commenting that women can neither paint nor write. Having passed these events, the joy in the party seems to disappear. Mrs. Ramsay reflects that joy is temporary, and at that moment, her husband arrives. They reflect on the Mr. Ramsay's insecurities and how they interrupt his peace. He only desires to have his wife to tell him that she loves him. So this is how the first part of the novel ends with the most notable events. So here come Time Passes. In Time Passes, war appears in Europe. Mrs. Ramsay passes away one night suddenly. Andrew Ramsay, the oldest son of the family, is killed during the war, and his sister, Prue, dies from an illness related to her childbirth. With the situation at that point, the family decides to avoid spending time in the summer house, which bit by bit wears itself down. Weeds prevail in the garden, and there are a lot of spiders spread around the house. 10 years are needed before the family returns. Despite of this fact, there is a housekeeper called Mrs. McNabb, who employs other women to restore the house. The place passed from oblivion to luminosity, and everything is in order when Lily Briscoe is there to finish her painting. Then, this is how the second part of the novel ends. In this section, a stream of consciousness comes again, as in the first section of the novel. Mr. Ramsay accepts that he and James and Cam, one of his daughters, will set forth to the lighthouse. On the morning, Mr. Ramsay has an attack of temper, which happens when he meets Lily Briscoe at the restored summer house. He gently asks for sympathy, but Lily rejects him. The family departs and Lily Briscoe takes her place on the lawn, determined to finish her abandoned painting that she began in her last visit to the summer house. James and Cam consider that her father is silly because of his constant attempt of asking for sympathy in others. They get mad at him. During the trip to the lighthouse, the two siblings feel fondness for their father. Even James, who had a thaw relationship with his father in the past. Across the bay, Lily Briscoe gives the finishing touch to her painting and realizes that her painting matches with her vision of the world. In Time Passes,
now, I'm going to talk about the three main characters to the lighthouse. In this case, Mr. Ramsay, Mrs. Ramsay, and Lily Briscoe. Now, Mr. Ramsay, Mrs. Ramsay is Mr. Ramsay's wife, a beautiful and loving woman. Mrs. Ramsay is a wonderful hostess who takes pride in making memorable experience with the guests at the family's summer home in the eyes of the sky.
Mrs. Ramsay is presented as a woman of extraordinary beauty, incarnates Victorian femininity, takes care of everyone and for charity reasons. Always she has guests in her house, especially males, who she believes have delicate egos and need constant support and sympathy. Considering the role of women in that period, she reflects dutiful and love for her family. Nevertheless, she struggles with her husband's behaviors, like selfishness and rawness. Finally, in the third act, as readers, we discover that Mrs. Ramsay died the night of the date in which the first part of the plot takes place. The novel doesn't give us more information about his unexpected death.
Now, Mr. Ramsey is the Mrs. Ramsey's partner and well known as a transcendental thinker into the lighthouse. It's very important to mention that he also was the most important figure about the role of men in that time. And, for example, how with his behaviors and how he confronted some issues with his family.
Mr. Ramsey likes his household, but often functions like something of tyrant. He tends to be self-centered and severe due to his chronic personal expert stresses. He concerns more than anything that his due is minor in the huge general program of elements and that he will not be recalled by years to come. Well conscious of how endowed he is to have such an amazing household, he nevertheless tends to discipline his wife, kids, and visitors by strenuous their continuous consideration, interest, and help.
Lily Briscoe is a youthful individual and who befriends the Ramseys on the region of the sky. Mrs. Ramsey, like Mrs. Ramsey, Lily is affected by concerns that her doing doesn't have value, making the clarification doesn't have value in that time for women.
She creates a symbol of Mrs. Ramsey at the starting of the novel, but she has problems completing it. Besides, she was in love with Mrs. Ramsey. The views of men like Charles Tansley, who assert that woman cannot color or create, endanger to challenge her assurance as a special woman of To the Lighthouse. This novel was conceived and written as an analogy of the work that Lily Briscoe paints, a painting that acquires form and body with the pass of time. It is painting that is made in front of the eyes of the reader, who doesn't properly see the painting, but read it. At last, at the end of the novel, Lily Briscoe can finish her painting.
Now we have to mention and explain some symbols that are really important in this novel. One of the main symbols in the novel is the lighthouse, which is also the name of the book.
It could be read that a lighthouse is visible from the Ramsey's summer home but separate from it by a stretch of sea. Mr. Ramsey is looking at it and James Ramsey, his son, really wants to get there. Mr. Ramsey says they won't be able to say that to the lighthouse the next day, and James Ramsey contemplates murder. Had there been an axe handy, a poker, or any weapon that would have gashed a hole in his father's breast and killed him, there and then, James would have seized it.
In this case, it's found that the lighthouse is a symbol for traditional family structure, and how to control it has a lot to do with the family power.
James and Mr. Ramsey are men and they're both really into Mr. Ramsey. One is her husband and the other her son. In that way, the first moment makes feel they must compete for Mrs. Ramsey's attention, looking for the control as men they are.
Therefore, the lighthouse is a kind of phallic symbol and Mr. Ramsey an authority figure. James can complain about his dad, but in the end, he considers that his dad seems to wind up being right, and the power remains largely in Mr. Ramsey.
But what about Mrs. Ramsey? Well, Mrs. Ramsey finds Mr. Ramsey's place at the head of their traditional family necessary and natural, but she knows that it's hard for her children to accept. So she does her best to make everything run smoothly. That is her main talent. The Ramses traditional family would be impossible without her shooting influence.
Mrs. Ramsey makes charitable donations to the lighthouse, and that charitable work is linked to the lighthouse because it's part of the role as a traditional mother in terms of their care of people. If the lighthouse symbolizes the power that that has in the traditional family structure, the charity is like the mother's place in that power structure. The dad is a beacon. He's what people are imitating, while the mom takes care of everybody. As you can see, we are explaining every symbol from the different perspective of every character. We already talked about James and Mr. Ramsey, also from the perspective of Mrs. Ramsey, but what about Lily Briscoe?
The character of Lily Briscoe doesn't have to get married because she has her work. She can see the lighthouse, but instead of trying to get there, instead of trying to fit herself into a traditional womanly or maternal role, she paints the scene in front of her. She uses her art to represent the essence of the lighthouse without having to be part of everything it represents.
Lily basically marries her art, so there's no cause for her to try to sail to the lighthouse. In part 3, the lighthouse doesn't offer her anything besides an attractive view and some perspective on what drives Mr. Ramsey. The progression of Lily's painting throughout the novel is not only a symbol of the artistic dilemma faced by the modernist artist, but especially that of a female artist. At the beginning of the novel, Lily is clearly self-conscious about her art. When looking at her painting, she sees only what could be different about it, constantly comparing it to how other painters would have depicted it.
Not wanting others to look at it, thinking of Tansley saying, "Women can't paint, women can write." Lily struggles throughout the course of the novel to find a way to unite the shapes and lines in her painting in a meaningful way, and to find how to connect this mass on the right hand with that on the left. She eventually overcomes these insecurities surrounding being a woman, however, subduing all her impression as a woman to something much more general. From this point, the painting comes to represent the question of how to make concrete her vision. Lily's frustration is quite clear. It was a miserable machine, an inefficient machine, she thought. The human apparatus for painting or for feeling, it always broke down at the critical moment. This idea of a breakdown between portraying externally one's internal experience and the ways Lily eventually overcomes this in her painting represents a uniquely modernist dilemma explored in the arts.
The symbol of the house is especially important in the part of time passes. 10 years pass during this section, and with the Ramses gone, the passage of time is conveyed through the house's gradual decay.
There's huge use of personification in this section, with light, dark, wind, earth, and other forces of nature. The way nature is portrayed as an intruder invading the house, causing its eventual decay, symbolizes the impermanence of man and his constructions. The fact that the house is the primary image through which the effects of time are conveyed.
The time not only has a deeply effect only in the house structure, but also in the idea of the irrelevance of humanity on the scale of time, and how nature alone ultimately persists, which is yet another common modernist topic.
Now let's move to the analysis about the novel, to the lighthouse. In this case, we take our main thesis statement and then we explain this thesis according to two main arguments. These arguments will be developed in the, for example, the theoretical part, and the second one is according to the novel itself.
Into the Lighthouse, the character of Lily Briscoe manifests androgyny as a feminist stand in the 20th century English society. Mrs. Ramsay represents submitted women's role in early years of 20th century. It means before the World War I.
I'm going to explain about the first argument and the woman's desire to marriage and how it's connected with the only way that women can rise into the society only by marriage.
The aspect to analyze it is acknowledged that they spend many of the first years of their lives in acquiring and smattering of accomplishment. Meanwhile, strength of body and mind are sacrificed to liberty notions of beauty, to desire of establishing themselves the only way women can rise in the world, by marriage. Now, in terms of the connection with the work, we can see when Mrs. Ramsay always had the strong thought that women should marry a man that could give them all they need. In this case, Lily Briscoe and William Bankes. But Lily Briscoe was never interested in William Bankes because she was in love of Mrs. Ramsay.
The second idea refers to the education of women, and Wollstonecraft said that this education was aiming to corporeal accomplishment.
The connection of the second argument with the novel is based on the idea that Mrs. Ramsay didn't understand most of the academic language that Mr. Ramsay used. This happens when Woolf writes, "He worked hard, 7 hours a day. His subject was now the influence of somebody upon somebody. They were walking on, and Mr. Ramsay did not quite catch the meaning, only the words, here and there. Dissertation, fellowship, readership, lectureship. She could not follow the ugly academic jargon."
Now, in the third part of the first argument, according to Wollstonecraft, he says about how men try to secure or attempting to keep them women as a state of a childhood.
Now, the second argument. Lily Briscoe represents androgyny traits on women's role after the World War I. Well, for this first supporting statement, we took some notes on feminist literary criticism by Wollstonecraft in 1793. So, the first aspect to analyze is the persuasion of submitted women to become more liberal beings.
Wollstonecraft argues that soft phrases, susceptibility of heart, delicacy of sentiment, and refinement of taste are almost synonymous with epithets of weakness. In this way, women were made to do more than satisfying the eye of men or showing them affection. What is the connection we have stated until this point with the work of To the Lighthouse? We have that Lily Briscoe is a character that feels able to express herself through art, and considers that any soft trait in women is a weakness. One of those soft traits is the search of love in men. They need to be dependent on the love of man to be admired and recognized. That is why she remains single, because marriage represents domination of men over women.
Well, for this second aspect to analyze, we have that women need a room of their own to express their intellectual abilities.
Women did not have the right to write in long periods of time. They had only 30 minutes to do it, and it had to be in the living room, where all the members of the family had the chance to see what she was doing. Women needed a room of their own to write, paint, or develop any kind of intellectual activity, to be free of express themselves without having eyes over them, just judging. Woolf stated that, but how do we connect this with the work of To the Lighthouse? We have a short quotation about Lily Briscoe and her relationship, specifically with painting. Why then did she do it? She looked at the canvas, lightly scored with drawing lines. It would be hung in the servants' bedrooms. It would be rolled up and stuffed under a sofa. What was the good of doing it then? And she heard some boys saying that she couldn't paint, saying she couldn't create, as if she were caught up in one of those habitual currents in which after a certain time experience forms in the mind, so that one repeats words without being aware any longer who originally spoke them. Despite of this fact, we can say that Lily Briscoe dared to paint her vision of the world at the end of the novel. She admires Mrs. Ramsay, but feels that women need to be a step forward of the submission attitude. This means that they need to be respected as men are, valued as men are, and involved in crucial social, political matters.
The other element to analyze in this novel is based on the other book of Virginia Woolf, Rooms of One Ounce, and Woolf says that all humans have one female power and one male power in their minds. For men, the male powers outweighs the female powers, while the opposite is true for women in whose minds the female power outweighs the male one.
One uncomfortable state of being is that when the two powers live in harmony together, spiritually cooperating, if one is a man, still the woman part of the brain must have effect, and a woman also must have intercourse with the man in her.
So, Lily, moving towards androgyny, deviates from other women and thereby becomes less desirable for men. This is the other important aspect that we are analyzing now, because most men seem to be apprehensive of Lily and keep themselves distance from her.
In the novel, there are instances of Lily moving away from femininity, but also from masculinity, which will make her end up somewhere in between masculinity and femininity, somewhere where, according to Woolf, the female power is free to cooperate with the male power. It is clear that Lily has moved away from femininity when we observe her feelings to the items that surround her. Lily feels distance from objects and places with female connotations. For example, in this quote, sitting alone among the clean cups at the long table. The house, the place, the morning all seem strangers to her. The house has strong female connotations as the place where most women spend a great part of their lives, taking care of husband, children.
Hola amiga, soy feminista y mujer. Si eres hombre, a mi grupo
Well, so far we've discussed several aspects of this novel called The Lighthouse. But now we would like you to comment below the conclusions. Do you think there are the appropriate ones for this text? Thank you so much.
Violento no es ninguna moda, se me acaba el tinte azul, ahora toca rojo caoba. Soy una feminista con sentido del humor. Toc toc, ¿quién es? Soy un hombre opresor. Yo digo lo que es o lo que no es gracioso. Si no es moralmente correcto, sufrirás mi acoso. Subo fotos en pelotas sin llamar la atención. Si te fijas en mis tetas, eres un violador. Reivindico